The letter arrived on a Tuesday that felt like any other Tuesday, which is perhaps the cruelest irony of life, how the moments that change everything often begin with such devastating ordinariness. Sarah Martinez stood in her cramped apartment kitchen, still wearing yesterday's scrubs from her double shift at the hospital, holding an envelope that bore the official seal of Henderson Associates, attorneys at law. The paper felt heavier than it should have, weighted with the finality of words she wasn't ready to read. Her father had been gone for 3 months now. 3 months since the cancer finally won its patient, relentless war against Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez, United States Army, retired. 3 months after Sarah had stood at his graveside, watching the flag-draped coffin disappear into Tennessee clay while taps played, she wondered how someone who had survived 2 tours in Afghanistan could be defeated by something invisible to the naked eye. The apartment around her seemed to pulse with his absence, his reading glasses still on the coffee table, his favorite mug unwashed in the sink because cleaning it felt like erasing him entirely. Sarah's fingers trembled as she tore open the envelope. She had expected this letter for weeks, had dreaded it, really. The reading of the will, the final accounting of a life lived modestly but with dignity. The formal language of legal documents blurred before her tired eyes, all whereases and heretofores that seemed designed to distance the living from the reality of death. But then, buried in the 3rd paragraph, words jumped out at her like a slap. Including all property located at 1247 Old Mill Road, specifically the barn structure and surrounding 2.3 acres. Sarah read the sentence again, then a 3rd time. A barn? Her father owned a barn? In all her 28 years, through all their conversations about money and worry and making ends meet, he had never once mentioned owning property, not once. She thought she knew every detail of his modest financial situation, the checking account with its careful balance, the savings account that had been steadily depleted by medical bills, the life insurance policy that would just barely cover funeral expenses. But a barn? 2.5 acres of land? She sank into the wobbly kitchen chair where her father had read the newspaper aloud each morning, his gravelly voice warm with hard-earned appreciation for ordinary moments. "Mija," he used to say, using the Spanish endearment his own father had whispered to him. "The news is mostly bad, but I read it anyways, so the world knows somebody's paying attention." She could hear his voice now, could almost smell the black coffee he drank strong enough to wake the dead and the aftershave that never quite covered the scent of the medicated creams he rubbed into his scarred leg. The lawyer's letter included an address, 1247 Old Mill Road, and a key taped to the bottom of the page with transparent tape that had yellowed with time. The key was old, heavy, the kind that belonged to locks that predated the digital age. She turned it over in her palm, feeling the weight of questions she couldn't yet formulate. Why hadn't he told her? What had he been hiding? And more unsettling still, what else didn't she know about the man who had raised her alone after her mother left when Sarah was 12? That afternoon, Sarah called in sick to work for the first time in 2 years. She told herself it was grief, that she needed time to process this unexpected inheritance, but the truth was simpler and more complicated. She couldn't concentrate on anything else. The mystery of the barn had lodged itself in her chest like a splinter, impossible to ignore. She drove her father's old Ford pickup, another inheritance, this one expected, through the winding back roads of rural Tennessee. The truck still smelled like him, motor oil and peppermints, and the particular mustiness of a vehicle that had seen better decades. His dog tags hung from the rearview mirror, casting tiny rainbows on the dashboard. She left them there because moving them felt like betrayal. The address led her down a gravel road she'd never traveled, past farmhouses with sagging porches and fields where cattle grazed behind wire fences. The GPS on her phone kept insisting she'd arrived, but all she could see was overgrown pastureland and a rusted mailbox that leaned at a dangerous angle. Then, through a gap in the trees, she spotted it, a barn that had clearly seen better decades. The structure was massive, bigger than she'd imagined. built from weathered wood that had faded to the gray of old bones. The roof sagged in places, and wild honeysuckle had claimed the eastern wall, but it stood solid against the sky like a monument to some forgotten purpose. The surrounding property was overgrown with tall grass and wildflowers, creating a natural meadow that buzzed with insects and small birds. Sarah parked beside the barn and sat for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled. The silence here was different from the silence in her apartment. This was the quiet of growing things, of wind through leaves, of a world that continued its ancient business regardless of human concerns. She could hear cows lowing in a distant field, the liquid trill of a meadowlark, the whisper of wind through the gaps in the barn's siding. The key fit perfectly in the heavy padlock that secured the main doors. The metal was stiff with age and weather, but it turned with a click that seemed to echo across the empty fields. Sarah pulled the doors open, hinges protesting with squeaks that sounded like small animals in distress. The interior of the barn was a cavern of shadows and dust motes dancing in shafts of sunlight that streamed through gaps in the roof. The air smelled of hay and motor oil, leather, and something else. Something metallic and sharp that she couldn't identify. As her eyes adjusted to the dimness, shapes began to emerge from the shadows. Workbenches covered with tarps, tools hanging from hooks on the walls, and in the far corner, something large and angular, covered by what looked like military surplus canvas. Sarah walked deeper into the barn, her footsteps echoing in the vast space. The concrete floor was stained with decades of oil and work, and she noticed that despite the barn's weathered exterior, the interior was surprisingly organized. Every tool had its place, every surface had been carefully arranged. This wasn't the random accumulation of a pack rat. This was the methodical organization of someone with purpose. Sarah approached the large covered shape in the corner, her heart beating faster for reasons she couldn't name. The canvas was held down with bungee cords that had been secured with military precision. As she began to unhook them, dust cascaded down like snow, making her sneeze. The sound echoed through the barn like gunshots. When the last cord came free, Sarah pulled away the canvas and gasped. Underneath was a vehicle unlike anything she'd ever seen. Sleek, angular, painted in matte black with no visible license plates or identifying marks. It looked like something from a science fiction movie, all sharp edges and tinted glass, sitting on tires that seemed designed for terrain far more challenging than Tennessee backroads. But it was what she found next that made her hands shake and her breath catch in her throat. Arranged on the workbenches with museum-like precision were items that belonged in movies, not in the barn of a retired staff sergeant who lived on a pension and complained about the price of groceries. A sound from outside made her freeze, the crunch of gravel under tires. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she quickly covered the document and moved toward one of the barn's side windows. A black sedan was pulling up the gravel drive, moving slowly like a predator stalking prey. The windows were tinted dark enough to be illegal in most states. The car stopped beside her father's pickup, and two figures emerged. Even from a distance, Sarah could tell they weren't locals. Their suits were too perfectly tailored, their movements too controlled, too purposeful. They moved like her father had moved, with the particular alertness of people trained to see threats in every shadow. Sarah's mind raced. Whatever this barn contained, whatever her father had been involved in, it was significant enough to draw the attention of people who drove government-issue sedans and wore earpieces. She thought of all the nights he'd sat up late, claiming he couldn't sleep, how he'd always been the first to know when helicopters flew over their neighborhood, the way he taught her to be aware of her surroundings with an intensity that had seemed excessive for a small Tennessee town. The men were walking toward the barn now, and Sarah realized with growing panic that she was trapped. The main doors were the only exit large enough for a person, and they were walking straight toward those doors. Her mind cataloged her options with the same methodical clarity her father had taught her. Hide, run, or confront. None of them seemed particularly promising. She ducked behind the mysterious vehicle, her heart pounding so loud she was certain it would give her away. Through the gap between the barn doors, she could see the men approaching. One spoke into his wrist, the gesture casual but unmistakably professional. "Target location confirmed," she heard him say, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Beginning sweep now." Sarah closed her eyes and tried to channel her father's voice, the lessons he taught her without her ever realizing they were lessons. Stay calm, assess your resources, remember that panic kills more people than bullets. She took a deep breath and looked around her hiding spot with new eyes, not as the overwhelmed daughter of a dead veteran, but as the daughter of a man who had clearly been much more than he'd ever let her know. Whatever secrets lay buried in this barn, whatever legacy her father had left her, she was about to discover that some inheritances come with a price that goes far beyond simple taxes and legal fees. The men were at the barn doors now, and in the growing shadows of late afternoon, Sarah Martinez was about to learn that the most dangerous truths are often the ones that hide in the most ordinary places. This story is taking some unexpected turns, isn't it? If you're invested in finding out what happens to Sarah, please subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss these thrilling stories. Your support keeps these tales coming.
The barn doors creaked as one of the men tested them. Sarah realized with growing horror that she'd left them unlocked. In her shock at discovering the barn's contents, she'd forgotten to secure the entrance behind her. The oversight now seemed catastrophic, a rookie mistake her father never would have made. She could almost hear his voice, patient but firm. "Mija, the first rule of staying safe is controlling your environment. Always know your exits, always secure your position." But her father had never told her about this place, had never prepared her for this moment. For 28 years, she'd thought she knew him. The quiet man who read her bedtime stories and taught her to change a tire, who struggled with nightmares he never talked about and walked with a limp that told its own story of service and sacrifice. Now, crouched behind equipment that belonged in spy novels, she wondered if she'd known him at all. The first man entered the barn, and Sarah held her breath so tightly her lungs burned. She could hear him moving methodically, his footsteps confident and purposeful. A small flashlight beam swept across the walls, illuminating the organized chaos of her father's secret workshop. Tools glinted in the light, some she recognized from helping him fix their old car, others that looked like they belonged in an operating room or a laboratory. "Sir," the second man called from outside, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "You need to see this." Sarah risked a glance around the edge of the vehicle. The first man had stopped his search and was walking back toward the entrance. Through the gap in the doors, she could see his partner kneeling beside her father's pickup, examining something on the ground. Even from her hiding spot, she could see what had caught his attention. Tire tracks in the soft earth, fresh ones that her truck had made when she'd parked just minutes ago. "Recently," the kneeling man said, his voice carrying clearly. "Less than an hour. Tread pattern suggests a civilian vehicle, standard radials. Someone's been here very recently." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Of course they would notice the tire tracks. These weren't random intruders, they were professionals, the kind of people who noticed details that others missed, who could read a crime scene like a book. Her father had been one of them once, she realized. All those years of him teaching her to be observant, to pay attention to her surroundings, to trust her instincts, those hadn't been the random lessons of an overprotective parent. They'd been the professional habits of someone who lived in a world where inattention could be fatal. "Control, this is Alpha Team. We have evidence of recent activity at the secondary location, requesting permission to expand search perimeter." The radio crackled with static, then a voice Sarah couldn't quite make out responded. The man listened, then nodded to his partner. "Copy that. Beginning immediate sweep. If the target is here, we find them." Target. The word hit Sarah like a physical blow. She wasn't just a witness who'd stumbled onto something she shouldn't have seen. She was a target. These people weren't here by accident. They were looking for her specifically. But why? What could she possibly know that would make her worth hunting? The answer came to her with the terrible clarity of puzzle pieces falling into place. The barn, the equipment, the foreign documents. Her father hadn't just been hiding things from her, he'd been protecting her from them. And now, 3 months after his death, whatever protection his silence had provided was gone. She was alone with secrets she didn't understand, and people who wanted to ensure those secrets stayed buried. The first man re-entered the barn, moving more quickly now, his flashlight beam sweeping in efficient arcs. Sarah pressed herself deeper into the shadows behind the vehicle, but she knew it was only a matter of minutes before he found her. The barn was large, but there were only so many places to hide, and these men were clearly trained in systematic searches. As the beam of light drew closer, Sarah's mind raced through her options. She could surrender, try to convince them she knew nothing about whatever her father had been involved in, but the cold professionalism in their voices suggested they weren't the type to take chances on her ignorance. She could try to run, but where? The barn doors were blocked, and she didn't know if there were other exits. Even if she made it outside, her truck was blocked in, and these men had radios, backup, resources she couldn't match.
That left fighting, and the thought terrified her. Sarah had never been in a real fight in her life. The closest she'd come to violence was breaking up disputes between drunk patients in the ER, and that hardly qualified as combat training. These men moved like soldiers, like her father had moved when he was being careful, when something had triggered the alertness he carried like a scar from his military service. But as the flashlight beams swept closer, Sarah realized she might not have a choice. Her father had taught her to shoot, reluctantly, after she'd insisted, at a gun range an hour outside town. "Mija," he'd said, his voice heavy with the weight of experience, "I pray you never need this, but if you do, remember, hesitation kills. If someone means you harm, you don't give them a second chance to hurt you." The problem was, she didn't have a weapon. Her purse was in the truck, along with the small .38 her father had insisted she carry. Here in the barn, surrounded by his mysterious equipment, she was defenseless except for whatever tools she could improvise. Her eyes adjusted to the shadows, and she began to inventory what was within reach. Screwdrivers, wrenches, a crowbar hanging from a hook on the nearby wall. None of them seemed adequate against trained professionals, but they were better than nothing. Sarah's hand closed around the handle of a heavy wrench, and she was surprised by how natural the weight felt in her grip. The man was getting closer now. She could hear him moving along the far wall, checking behind each piece of equipment with methodical precision. His partner had entered the barn as well, and they were working in coordination, one taking the left side while the other took the right. They would meet in the middle, where Sarah was hiding, in less than 2 minutes. As fear flooded her system, Sarah discovered something she'd never known about herself. She was angry. Not just frightened, but furious. These men had no right to be here, no right to invade the one place her father had kept private. They spoke of him like he was just another file in their bureaucratic system, reduced to dates and registration numbers. They had no idea who he'd been, the man who made pancakes shaped like animals on Sunday mornings, who stayed up all night when she had the flu, who taught her to drive in empty parking lots and never once lost his patience when she stalled the engine. The anger was warm and sharp and gave her something to focus on besides the terror. Her father had been a good man, whatever else he might have been. He'd raised her alone after her mother left, worked double shifts to pay for her nursing school, celebrated every small victory in her life like it was his own. If he'd kept secrets, if he'd been involved in things she couldn't understand, there had to be a reason. There had to be. The flashlight beam was 20 feet away now, sweeping in careful arcs. She could see the man clearly, tall, athletic, probably in his 30s with the kind of short haircut that screamed military or law enforcement. His partner was older, graying at the temples, moving with the economy of motion that comes from years of experience. Both of them carried themselves like people accustomed to being the most dangerous thing in any room. But they didn't know about Sarah. They thought they were hunting a frightened civilian who'd stumbled onto something she couldn't handle. They had no idea who Miguel Martinez's daughter was. Raised by a man who'd survived 2 combat tours and 20 years of whatever he had to maintain a secret workshop in a barn no one knew he owned. The flashlight beam swept closer, and Sarah made her decision. She wasn't going to hide anymore. She wasn't going to cower behind her father's secrets and hope these people would simply go away. They wanted to know what Miguel Martinez's daughter knew about her father's work. She was going to show them exactly what kind of daughter a man like Miguel Martinez would raise. Sarah stepped out from behind the vehicle, the wrench heavy in her hand, and spoke in a voice that surprised her with its steadiness. "You're trespassing. This is private property, and you need to leave now." Both men spun toward her voice, their movements fluid and controlled. The younger one's hand moved automatically toward what Sarah now realized was a shoulder holster hidden beneath his jacket. But he stopped when he saw her, taking in her scrubs, her tired eyes, the way she held the wrench like she might actually know how to use it. "Ma'am," the older man said, his voice carefully neutral, "I'm Agent Morrison, Federal Bureau of Investigation. This is Agent Chen. We're conducting an authorized investigation, and we need you to put down the tool and step away from the vehicle." FBI. The letters hit Sarah like a physical blow, but she forced herself not to react. Her father had taught her that showing fear was the same as showing weakness, and weakness invited attack. "I'd like to see your warrant," she said, proud that her voice didn't shake. "And your badges." Agent Morrison exchanged a glance with his partner, and Sarah saw something pass between them. A moment of uncertainty, perhaps surprise that the daughter of their target wasn't dissolving into hysterics. Morrison reached slowly into his jacket and produced a leather folder, flipping it open to reveal a badge and identification card. "Sarah Martinez," he said, and the fact that he knew her name made her stomach drop. "Daughter of Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez, deceased. Nurse at Mercy General Hospital. No criminal record, no known associates of interest." He recited the facts of her life like he was reading from a file, which she realized he probably was. "We know you're not involved in your father's activities, Ms. Martinez. We're here to help you understand what you inherited." "What I've inherited is a barn," Sarah said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew how hollow they sounded. The mysterious vehicle behind her, the sophisticated equipment scattered throughout the workshop, the foreign documents, none of it belonged in the simple inheritance of a disabled veteran's daughter. Agent Chen stepped forward, his hand still hovering near his weapon. "Ms. Martinez, your father was involved in activities that pose a threat to national security. This facility contains evidence of those activities. We need you to cooperate with our investigation." "National security?" Sarah almost laughed, but the sound that emerged was harsh and bitter. "My father fixed cars and watched game shows and complained about his arthritis. The most dangerous thing he did was grill hamburgers without checking if they were done." But even as she said it, she remembered the nights he'd sit up late, staring out the kitchen window to nothing she could see. The way he taught her to vary her route to work, to always park where she could see her car, to trust her instincts if something felt wrong. The nightmares that woke him up screaming in languages she didn't recognize. "Your father was a patriot," Agent Morrison said, his voice softer now, almost gentle. "But patriots sometimes make choices that put their families at risk. We believe he was trying to protect you by keeping you ignorant of his work. But now that work has become unstable. There are people who believe you know more than you do. People who won't be as reasonable as we are." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Other people were looking for her, people who wouldn't bother with badges or warrants or careful explanations, people who would hurt her to get what they wanted, whether she actually knew anything or not. Sarah felt the weight of the wrench in her hand, solid and real in a world that had suddenly become surreal. 3 months ago, her biggest worry had been covering her father's medical bills. Now federal agents were telling her that his death had exposed her to threats she couldn't begin to understand. "What kind of work?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know. Once she heard the answer,
There would be no going back to the simple grief of mourning a father who fixed cars and made terrible jokes. Once she knew the truth, she would have to live with it forever. Agent Morrison looked at Agent Chen again, and Sarah saw the younger man nod almost imperceptibly. Some kind of decision had been made, some line crossed that meant there was no point in pretending anymore. "Your father," Agent Morrison said, "was one of the most effective intelligence assets the United States has ever had. For 15 years after his official retirement from the Army, he operated deep cover missions in locations where traditional agents couldn't go. This facility was his operational base for domestic activities." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Intelligence asset, deep cover missions, operational base. The language of espionage and international intrigue applied to a man who taught her to make grilled cheese sandwiches and helped her with algebra homework.
"You're lying," she said. But the words felt hollow, even as she spoke them. Too many things suddenly made sense. The languages he spoke that he claimed to have learned in the service. The way he could disappear for days at a time with explanations that never quite added up. The money that sometimes appeared without explanation to cover unexpected expenses. "We're not," Agent Chen said, speaking for the first time since they had identified themselves. "And now that he's gone, the network he built, the intelligence he gathered, the contacts he maintained, all of it is vulnerable. Some of his former associates believe you might know how to access his files, his accounts, his operational records. They're wrong, but they won't believe that until they've extracted the information from you themselves." Sarah's grip tightened on the wrench. "Extracted?" "Tortured," Agent Morrison said bluntly. "Killed when they realize you don't know anything useful. Your father spent 15 years making enemies of some very dangerous people, Ms. Martinez. His death has left you exposed to those enemies." The barn seemed to tilt around Sarah, the familiar world of her life sliding away like furniture on a sinking ship. Everything she'd thought she knew, everything she'd believed about her father, about herself, about the quiet safety of their small-town life, all of it had been an illusion, a carefully constructed lie designed to protect her from a truth too dangerous to know. But now the truth was here, standing in front of her with federal badges and weapons and the casual certainty of people who dealt with life and death as routine paperwork. Her father was gone, and the protection his silence had provided was gone with him. She was alone, with secrets she didn't understand and enemies she couldn't see, holding nothing but a wrench and 28 years of believing the world was fundamentally safe for people who minded their own business and worked hard and tried to be good. "What do you want from me?" she asked, and her voice sounded small and lost in the vastness of the barn. Agent Morrison's expression softened slightly, and for the first time, he looked at her like a person rather than a problem to be solved. "We want to keep you alive, but to do that, we need your help, and you need ours." The silence stretched between Sarah and the two federal agents like a taut wire, vibrating with unspoken threats and impossible choices. Agent Morrison's words hung in the air. "We want to keep you alive." And Sarah found herself weighing the sincerity in his voice against the cold calculation in his eyes. These men dealt in life and death as casually as she dealt with bedpans and IV drips, and the realization made her grip the wrench tighter. "Help you how?" Sarah asked, though even as she spoke, she suspected she wouldn't like the answer. Nothing about this situation suggested she had any real choice in what came next. The barn that had seemed like a refuge an hour ago now felt like a tomb, filled with evidence of her father's double life and surrounded by people who viewed her as an asset or a liability. Agent Chen stepped closer, his hand still hovering near his weapon with the casual readiness of someone accustomed to violence. "Your father kept detailed records of his operations, financial accounts, contact information, operational protocols. Those records are encrypted and hidden, but we believe he may have left you some way to access his files, his accounts, his operational records. I told you I don't know anything about, Sarah began, but Morrison cut her off with a sharp gesture. Listen, he said, urgently, pulling a small device from his jacket that looked like a cross between a radio and a smartphone. The screen was flashing red, and even from across the barn, Sarah could see numbers counting down. We have a problem. Satellite surveillance shows 3 vehicles approaching this location, not ours, moving in tactical formation. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Who are they? The people I told you about, the ones who won't be as reasonable as we are. He looked at Chen, and some silent communication passed between them. We need to move, now. But before anyone could move, the sound of engines reached them. Deep, powerful rumbles that spoke of vehicles built for purposes other than casual transportation. She could hear them coming up the gravel drive, moving fast but not carelessly. Professional. Coordinated. Deadly.
Agent Chen drew his weapon in one fluid motion, a black automatic that seemed to absorb light. Hostile contacts, 3 vehicles, range approximately 400 meters in closing. He spoke into his radio with the clipped efficiency of someone reporting battlefield conditions. Control, this is Alpha Team. We are compromised and request immediate backup. The radio crackled with static, then a voice that sounded like it was coming from very far away. Alpha Team, nearest backup is 20 minutes out. You are authorized to use any means necessary to protect the asset. The asset. Sarah realized with growing horror that she was the asset, not a person to be protected, but a thing to be preserved for its usefulness. The knowledge sat in her stomach like lead, cold and heavy and nauseating. Miss Martinez, Morrison said, his voice taking on the tone of someone issuing orders rather than making requests. We need to get you out of here. Is there another exit to this barn? Sarah shook her head, then stopped. Her father had been thorough in everything else. Was it possible he'd been thorough about escape routes too? She looked around the barn with new eyes, searching for anything that might suggest another way out. The main doors were the obvious exit, but there were windows high up near the roofline, and what looked like a smaller door on the far wall that she'd assumed led to a storage room. There might be, she said, pointing toward the smaller door. I haven't explored everything yet. The sound of the approaching vehicles was getting louder, closer. Sarah could distinguish individual engines now, 3 distinct rumbles that spoke of heavy, powerful machines. Through the gaps in the barn's siding, she caught glimpses of black shapes moving between the trees, resolving into vehicles that looked like they belonged in a war zone rather than rural Tennessee. Agent Chen had positioned himself near one of the windows, his weapon trained on the approach. Hostiles have stopped, range 200 meters. Looks like they're deploying on foot. How many? Morrison asked, checking his own weapon with practiced efficiency. Hard to tell from this angle. At least 6, possibly more. They're using military tactics, establishing a perimeter before they move in. Sarah felt a strange detachment settle over her, as if she were watching this scene play out from a great distance. 24 hours ago, her biggest concern was whether her father's insurance would cover the cost of his headstone. Now, armed men were surrounding a barn she'd never known existed, hunting her for information she didn't possess, about a father who'd apparently lived a life that belonged in movies rather than small-town Tennessee. Miss Martinez, Morrison said sharply, and Sarah realized he'd been speaking to her. We need to check that door, now. Sarah nodded and started across the barn, her feet moving automatically while her mind struggled to process what was happening. The smaller door was secured with another heavy padlock, but the key from the lawyer's envelope fit this lock as well. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely turn the key, but finally the lock clicked open. Behind the door was not a storage room, but a narrow corridor that led into darkness. The walls were concrete, and the air that drifted out smelled of earth and machinery.
Emergency lighting flickered to life as the door opened, revealing a tunnel that stretched into blackness beyond the reach of the lights. "Escape route," Morrison said with satisfaction. "Your father was definitely a professional." He turned to Chen. "How much time do we have?" "They're moving in now, multiple contacts approaching from different angles. Maybe 2 minutes before they reach the barn." Morrison grabbed Sarah's arm, not roughly, but with unmistakable authority. "We're going. Stay close, do exactly what I tell you, and maybe we'll all live through this." But as they started toward the tunnel, the barn's main doors exploded inward with a crash that shook dust from the rafters. The blast wasn't from explosives. Someone had simply rammed the doors with something heavy and unstoppable. Sunlight poured through the opening, and silhouetted against it were figures in tactical gear, moving with the coordinated precision of a military unit. "Federal agents," Morrison shouted, his weapon raised. "Stand down!" The response was immediate and devastating. Automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions, bullets whining through the air and sparking off metal surfaces. Sarah screamed and threw herself to the ground as chunks of wood and concrete exploded around her. The noise was overwhelming, not just the gunfire, but the sound of metal being shredded, glass breaking, and something that might have been Agent Chen crying out in pain. Morrison grabbed Sarah and hauled her toward the tunnel entrance, half carrying her as bullets whistled overhead. "Move, move, move," he shouted over the noise, his voice raw with adrenaline and fear. Sarah stumbled into the tunnel, her ears ringing from the gunfire. Behind her, she could hear Chen returning fire, the sharp crack of his pistol almost lost in the roar of automatic weapons. Morrison pushed her deeper into the tunnel, then turned back toward the barn. "Chen," he yelled, "fall back, we're leaving." "Negative," came the reply, strained with pain. I'm hit, can't move. Get the asset out of here." Asset. Even bleeding and possibly dying, Agent Chen thought of her as an asset rather than a person with the knowledge should have made Sarah angry, but instead it filled her with a strange kind of clarity. These people, the FBI agents, the attackers, whoever else might be hunting her, they all saw her as a thing to be used or eliminated, not a human being with her own thoughts and feelings and right to exist. But she was Miguel Martinez's daughter, and Miguel Martinez had not raised a thing. He had raised a woman who could think under pressure, who could adapt to impossible situations, who could survive. The anger that had been building since the agents first appeared crystallized into something harder and more useful: determination. Morrison was still at the tunnel entrance, firing into the barn. I could see muzzle flashes strobing in the darkness, turning the familiar space into a hellscape of violence and chaos. The mysterious vehicle her father had hidden was being systematically destroyed, bullets punching through its armor like it was made of paper. "Agent Morrison," I called over the noise, "we need to go now." He looked back at me, and I saw something in his face that might have been surprising. Perhaps he had expected her to be cowering in terror, paralyzed by fear and confusion. Instead, she was standing in the tunnel mouth, calm and focused, ready to move. "Chen's down," Morrison said as he backed into the tunnel. "We can't help him." "Then we honor his sacrifice by staying alive," Sarah replied, words that sounded like something her father might have said. "He's buying us time. Let's use it." Morrison nodded and triggered some kind of mechanism that caused the tunnel door to begin sliding shut. As it closed, Sarah caught one last glimpse of the barn, smoke and dust and the strobing muzzle flashes of a gunfight that had turned her father's secret workshop into a war zone. Then the door was sealed with a solid thunk, and they were alone in the tunnel, with nothing but emergency lighting and the sound of their own breathing. The tunnel stretched ahead of them, sloping gently downward into the earth. The walls were reinforced concrete, and Sarah could see that serious engineering had gone into its construction. This wasn't something her father had dug with a shovel in his spare time. This was military-grade infrastructure, built to withstand serious attempts to breach it. "How far does this go?" Morrison asked it, his voice echoing in the confined space. "I don't know," Sarah replied honestly. I didn't even know it existed until 5 minutes ago." They started walking, Morrison leading with his weapon ready, Sarah following close behind. The tunnel was wider than it had appeared from the barn, easily wide enough for two people to walk side by side. Emergency lighting strips ran along the ceiling, clicking on as they approached and dimming behind them as they passed. "Your father built this," Morrison said as they walked. "The engineering, the materials, the construction, this would have cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Where did he get that kind of money?" Sarah thought about the question. Her father had lived modestly, almost frugally. Their house had been small and old, their cars used and carefully maintained. She'd never seen evidence of significant wealth, never heard him talk about investments or savings beyond what was necessary for basic security. "I don't know," she said. "But if he built this, he must have had a reason. He must have known that someday someone would need to escape from that barn." "Someone like you," Morrison said grimly. They walked in silence for several minutes, the only sound their footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. Sarah found herself thinking about her father in ways she never had before. All those nights he'd stayed up late, all those unexplained absences, all those moments when he'd seemed to be listening for something she couldn't hear. Now they made a different kind of sense. He hadn't been restless or troubled by his memories of war. He'd been working, planning, preparing for threats she'd never imagined. The tunnel began to curve, and Sarah realized they were following the natural contours of the land, staying underground but avoiding the need for deeper excavation. Her father had thought of everything: drainage systems to prevent flooding, ventilation to provide fresh air, even what looked like supply caches built into alcoves along the walls. "Miss Martinez," Morrison said suddenly, stopping so abruptly that Sarah almost walked into him. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer." Sarah nodded, though she had a feeling she wasn't going to like the question. "Your father's work generated a lot of intelligence, a lot of sensitive information. If that information fell into the wrong hands, it could compromise ongoing operations, endanger active agents, even destabilize international relationships." Morrison's voice was deadly serious. "Before he died, did he say anything to you about his work? Anything about passwords or account numbers or how to access his files?" "No," Sarah said immediately. But then she stopped. Her father had said many things in his final weeks, rambling conversations fueled by pain medication and the approaching reality of death. Most of it had been memories of her childhood, expressions of love and pride, apologies for things he thought he'd done wrong as a parent. But there were other things, strange references to places they'd never been together, names of people she'd never heard him mention. At the time, she had attributed them to the morphine, to the way pain medication could scramble thoughts and memories. But now, in the context of everything she'd learned, those rambling conversations took on a new significance. "He mentioned a dog," she said suddenly. "He kept talking about a dog he had when I was little, but we never had a dog. I was allergic. He said I should remember to feed the dog, that the dog would know what to do if something happened to him." Morrison's eyes sharpened with interest. "What kind of dog? Did he give it a name?" "A German Shepherd, I think. He called it König. I remember because I thought it was strange that he'd give a dog a German name." Sarah paused, memory bringing back more details. "He said König was smart, that König had been trained to find things. He made me promise I'd take care of König if he couldn't." "König means king in German," Morrison said thoughtfully. "It could be a code name or an operational designation." He pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly. "If your father was running assets in Eastern Europe, German would be a logical operational language." The tunnel ahead of them opened into a larger space, and as they emerged, Sarah gasped. They were in what could only be described as an underground bunker, a fully equipped operational center built into the earth beneath rural Tennessee. Banks of computers lined the walls, all dark and silent now, but clearly sophisticated and expensive. Maps covered every available surface, marked with pins and notations in languages Sarah couldn't read. But what caught her attention most was the corner of the bunker that had been set up like a small apartment. A bed, a kitchenette, even a bookshelf filled with technical manuals and what looked like foreign language dictionaries. This wasn't just an escape route. It was a place where someone could live and work for extended periods. "Jesus," Morrison breathed, looking around the space. "Your father wasn't just an asset. He was running his own network." Sarah walked to one of the computers and touched the keyboard gently. The screen flickered to life, displaying a login prompt that asked for username and password. Above the prompt was a logo she didn't recognize, a stylized eagle perched on a globe, with text in what might have been German or Dutch. "Can you access this?" Morrison asked, moving to stand beside her. "I don't know the password," but even as she spoke, her father's rambling words came back to her. König, a dog that would know what to do, a German shepherd that had been trained to find things. Almost without conscious thought, Sarah typed König into the username field. The cursor moved to the password prompt, blinking expectantly. She thought about her father's final conversations, trying to remember anything else that might be significant. He'd talked about taking care of the dog, about making sure it was fed. What did you feed a German shepherd? Dog food, obviously, but her father had been specific about something. He said I should give König his favorite treat, Leberwurst. He kept saying I should remember to give König Leberwurst. Morrison nodded encouragingly. "Try it." Sarah typed Leberwurst into the password field and pressed enter. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the screen changed, displaying what looked like a complex file directory with folders labeled in multiple languages. Numbers, dates, geographical coordinates, and what might have been operational code names. My God, it's all here. 20 years of intelligence operations. But before Sarah could respond, an alarm began blaring throughout the bunker. Red lights flashed, and a computerized voice began speaking in what sounded like German. Sicherheitsvergiftung erkannt. Notfallprotokoll aktiviert. What's it saying? Sarah asked, but Morrison was already moving toward the exit. Security breach detected. Emergency protocol activated, he translated grimly. Someone's found the tunnel entrance. We need to leave, now. But as they turned toward what Sarah had assumed was another exit, she realized with growing horror that there wasn't one. The bunker had only one entrance, the tunnel they'd just come through. And if someone had found that tunnel, they were trapped. The computer screen was flashing now, displaying what looked like a countdown timer. Sarah realized that her father, thorough as always, had built one final safeguard into his secret life. If the bunker was compromised, if unauthorized personnel gained access to his files, everything would be destroyed rather than allowed to fall into enemy hands.
"How long do we have?" Morrison asked, reading the display over her shoulder. 5 minutes, Sarah said, watching the numbers tick downward. Then what happens? Morrison was examining what looked like ventilation shafts near the ceiling. Knowing your father's thoroughness, this whole place probably gets filled with inert gas or the ceiling comes down or both. Sarah felt a strange calm settle over her. Her father had built this place as a last resort, a final refuge for someone who had run out of other options. He'd equipped it with everything necessary for survival, but he'd also ensured that if survival wasn't possible, the secrets it contained would die with whoever was trapped inside. It was, she realized,
Exactly the kind of thorough, ruthless planning that a man who lived in the shadows would make. And now his daughter was about to become the final victim of his careful preparations. But Sarah Martinez had not survived 28 years as Miguel Martinez's daughter by giving up when things looked impossible. She had been raised by a man who'd taught her that there was always another option, always another way forward, if you were smart enough and determined enough to find it. She turned back to the computer and began scrolling through her father's files, looking for anything that might help them escape the trap he'd so carefully constructed. Because if Koenig had been trained to find things, maybe Koenig could also help them find their way out. The countdown timer showed 4 minutes and 30 seconds remaining. The countdown timer showed 4 minutes and 30 seconds when Sarah's fingers found what she was looking for, a folder labeled Nautausgang, buried deep in her father's file directory. Even without speaking German, she could guess what it meant: emergency exit. Her father had been nothing if not thorough, and a man who built elaborate escape tunnels would certainly have planned for the possibility that even his most secure refuge might be compromised. "Morrison," she called, her voice steady despite the flashing red lights and the mechanical voice continuing its countdown in German. "I think I found something." The FBI agent abandoned his examination of the ventilation shafts and hurried to the computer. The folder contained architectural drawings, engineering specifications, and what looked like activation sequences for systems Sarah hadn't even known existed. But it was the first document that made her heart race with hope, a detailed schematic of the bunker showing not one tunnel entrance, but 3. "Son of a bitch," Morrison breathed, tracing the lines on the screen with his finger. "Your father built multiple escape routes. This one leads to an old storm drain about half a mile from here. This other one comes up in a grain silo on the neighboring property." Sarah was already clicking through the activation procedures, her nursing training helping her parse the technical language into actionable steps. Her father had designed the bunker's emergency systems like a hospital's disaster protocols, clear, logical, with multiple redundancies and backups. "The secondary exits are sealed until the emergency protocol is activated, but once we start the sequence, we have," she paused to calculate, 3 minutes to reach one of the exit points before the bunker seals permanently. "Which one's closer?" Morrison asked, checking his weapon and preparing to move. Sarah studied the schematics, trying to orient herself to their current position. The storm drain exit was longer, but seemed to follow relatively straight passages. The grain silo was closer, but required navigating through what the diagram labeled as defensive positions, whatever that meant. "Storm drain," she decided. "It's more direct, and if we're moving fast—" The lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a second later, bathing everything in hellish red. But for a moment, they were plunged into absolute darkness. In that moment of blindness, Sarah heard something that made her blood freeze. The sound of metal scraping against concrete, coming from the tunnel they'd used to enter the bunker. "They found the entrance," Morrison whispered, his voice barely audible over the continuing alarm. "How the hell did they track us through that tunnel so fast?" Sarah was already initiating the emergency protocol, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she followed her father's precisely documented procedures. The computer requested biometric confirmation, a handprint scanner that slid out from beneath the monitor like something from a science fiction movie. "It needs a handprint," she said, looking at Morrison in desperation. "My father's handprint." "Try yours," Morrison said urgently. "You're his daughter. Sometimes these systems are programmed for genetic matches." Sarah placed her hand on the scanner, feeling the warm light as it analyzed her palm and fingers. For a moment, nothing happened, and she was certain they were about to be trapped by her father's own security measures. Then the computer chimed softly, and new text appeared on the screen. "Genetic match confirmed. Welcome, Sarah. Your father's final protocols are now accessible." The words hit her like a physical blow. Her father had programmed the bunker's most secure systems to recognize her specifically. He'd known that someday she might be here, might need access to his deepest secrets, might be running for her life through the escape routes he'd built for precisely this situation. "He knew," she whispered, understanding flooding through her. "He knew this day would come." Morrison was monitoring the tunnel entrance with his weapon ready, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept glancing at the countdown timer. 2 minutes and 45 seconds remained. "Sarah," Morrison said urgently, Whatever revelation you're having, save it. We need to move." She completed the emergency protocol, and immediately the bunker transformed around them. What had appeared to be solid walls split open to reveal hidden passages, complete with their own emergency lighting and ventilation systems. The sound of mechanical systems coming online filled the air. Pumps, fans, and what might have been blast doors sealing off the primary tunnel. But it was what appeared on the computer screen that made Sarah stop breathing entirely. A video file had automatically opened, showing her father sitting in this very bunker, looking directly into the camera with the same serious expression he'd worn when teaching her to drive or explaining why she needed to be careful walking alone at night. "Mija," his recorded voice said, and Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "If you're seeing this, then I'm gone, and you're in danger. I'm sorry. I'm so very sorry that the choices I made have brought you to this place." Morrison was pulling at her arm, trying to get her to move toward the emergency exit, but Sarah couldn't look away from her father's face. This was a message meant specifically for her, recorded when he was healthy and alert before the cancer had stolen his strength and clarity. "I told you once that I fought in Afghanistan to protect our way of life. But that wasn't the whole truth. After I came home, I continued fighting, just in different ways. There are people in this world who would destroy everything good and decent if given the chance. I spent 20 years making sure they never got that chance."
The sound from the tunnel was getting louder. Voices, equipment, the careful movement of people who knew how to navigate confined spaces silently. Morrison had positioned himself at the bunker's main entrance, but Sarah could see the sweat on his forehead, the way his hand shook slightly as he gripped his weapon. "The work I did," her father's recording went on, "required me to become someone else, to lie to the people I loved most in the world, to let my own daughter think her father was nothing more than a broken-down veteran who couldn't hold a job. But everything I did, every lie I told, every night I spent away from home, it was all to protect you." Sarah wiped her eyes and forced herself to focus on the emergency exit. The passage stretched ahead of them, narrow but well lit, with clear markings indicating the path to the storm drain. But her father's words followed her as she began to move. "There's something else you need to know," the recording continued, and Sarah almost stopped walking again. "Your mother didn't leave because she couldn't handle my nightmares or my problems adjusting to civilian life. She left because she discovered what I was doing, and I had to make a choice between my work and my family. I chose my work because I still believe, that the work was too important to abandon." Morrison was behind her now, moving quickly through the narrow passage. The sounds of pursuit were growing fainter, muffled by the blast doors her father's systems had sealed, but Sarah knew their lead was temporary. Professional operators would find ways through or around any obstacle, given enough time. "But I was wrong," her father's voice echoed through speakers built into the tunnel walls. "I should have chosen you and your mother. I should have found another way to serve my country that didn't require me to sacrifice my family. By the time I realized that, it was too late. Your mother was gone, and you had grown up believing your father was someone he wasn't." The passage branched, and Sarah checked the schematic on her phone, following the route her father had marked to the storm drain exit. The tunnel here was older, rougher, carved from natural rock rather than constructed from concrete. They were moving through the root system of the Tennessee hills, following paths that predated human settlement. "The files you've accessed," the recording continued, "they contain 20 years of intelligence on networks that threaten American interests around the world. Drug cartels, arms dealers, human traffickers, terrorist cells, people who profit from misery and death. Some of those files could put dangerous people in prison for life. Others could prevent attacks that would kill thousands of innocent people." Sarah could see light ahead, not artificial emergency lighting, but actual daylight filtering down through what must be the storm drain opening. They were almost there, almost free of the underground maze her father had constructed to protect his secrets. The passage opened into a larger chamber carved from natural stone. Ancient-looking steel ladders led upward towards circles of daylight, storm drains that connected to the surface world. But it was what Sarah saw carved into the stone walls that made her stop in wonder and horror. Names.
hundreds of names carved carefully into the rock in her precise handwriting. Some were followed by dates and locations. Dmitry Volkov, Budapest, 2019, and Maria Santos, Cartagena, 2021, and dozens of others. But others were just names, with no dates or places, as if her father had run out of time or courage to document the full context. "My God," Morrison breathed, playing his flashlight beam across the wall of names. "These are his operations. Every person he recruited, every asset he ran, every network he infiltrated."
Sarah moved closer to the wall, reading names that represented a hidden war fought in shadows across the globe. But it was the section of wall nearest the ladder that made her hands shake. These names were different, written in a different style, with a different tool. And at the top of this section, in her father's careful script, were two words that explained everything: the cost. These weren't the names of assets or enemies. These were the names of people who had died because of her father's work. Agents who'd been exposed and killed, civilians caught in crossfire, innocent people who'd been in the wrong place when operations went bad. The names went on and on, a litany of loss that represented the true price of her father's secret war. "Sarah," Morrison said urgently, "we need to go, now." But Sarah was reading the names, seeing the dates, understanding finally what had driven her father to record that message, to build these elaborate escape routes, to plan for the day when his daughter would have to flee through tunnels lined with the ghosts of his choices. At the bottom of the wall of names, carved more recently than the others, was one that made Sarah's heart stop. Elena Martinez, left to protect her daughter, 2010. Her mother. Her mother's name was on her father's wall of costs, marked not as someone who had died, but as someone who had been sacrificed for the mission. Her father hadn't just chosen his work over his family. He'd driven her mother away deliberately to protect both of them from the dangers his double life created. "My mother," Sarah whispered. "She didn't leave because she couldn't handle his problems. She left because he made her leave." Morrison was already climbing the ladder, moving toward the circle of daylight above, but Sarah stood frozen before her father's confession carved in stone, finally understanding the true scope of what he'd done and why he'd done it. The recording had followed them even here, her father's voice emerging from speakers hidden in the rock ceiling. "The people hunting you now," he said, "they're not just after intelligence files or operational details. They're after something much more valuable: the location of offshore accounts containing evidence of corruption at the highest levels of government. Money that was supposed to fund legitimate operations was diverted to personal accounts, used to enrich politicians and bureaucrats who saw the war on terror as a business opportunity." Sarah began climbing the ladder, following Morrison toward the circle of daylight above. But her father's words climbed with her, explaining truths that transformed everything she thought she knew about his work and why it had made him so many enemies. "I discovered the corruption by accident. Bank records, financial transfers, contracts awarded to companies that existed only on paper. Billions of dollars stolen from programs meant to protect American lives, used instead to buy yachts and mansions and political influence. When I tried to report it through official channels, I learned that the corruption went all the way to the top." They reached the surface, a concrete storm drain that opened into a wooded area several hundred yards from any road. Morrison immediately began scanning for threats, his weapon ready, his training taking over. But Sarah sat on the edge of the drain opening, breathing fresh air and trying to process revelations that rewrote her entire understanding of her father's life and why it had made him so many enemies. "So I went rogue," her father's voice concluded, the recording apparently programmed to follow her through multiple speakers built into his escape network. The people hunting you now, they're not just after intelligence files or operational details. They're after something much more valuable: the location of offshore accounts containing evidence of corruption at the highest levels of government. Money that was supposed to fund legitimate operations was diverted to personal accounts, used to enrich politicians and bureaucrats who saw the war on terror as a business opportunity. Sarah began climbing the ladder, following Morrison toward the circle of daylight above, but her father's words climbed with her, explaining truths that transformed everything she thought she knew about his work and why it had made him so many enemies. "So I went rogue," her father's voice concluded, the recording apparently programmed to follow her through multiple speakers built into his escape network. "The people hunting you now, they're not just after intelligence files or operational details, they're after something much more valuable: the location of offshore accounts containing evidence of corruption at the highest levels of government. Money that was supposed to fund legitimate operations was diverted to personal accounts, used to enrich politicians and bureaucrats who saw the war on terror as a business opportunity." Morrison was on his radio, finally able to reach backup now that they were above ground. But his conversation was terse, urgent, filled with code words and references Sarah didn't understand. What she did understand was that they weren't safe yet, that the people hunting them had resources and reach that went beyond the gunmen who'd attacked the barn. "The accounts I mentioned," her father's recording said, "the evidence of corruption, I've left you the access codes, not because I want you to become a threat, but because you're already a threat. The only way to protect yourself is to make sure that evidence becomes public, that the people who want to silence you have more to lose from your death than from your survival." Sarah looked at Morrison, who had finished his radio call and was studying something on his phone. "Backup?" she asked.
20 minutes out, he replied. But we may not have 20 minutes. Satellite shows multiple vehicles converging on this area. Whatever your father started, it's bringing a lot of people out of the woodwork. Sarah stood up, brushing dirt from her scrubs, and made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. "Then we don't wait for backup," she said. "My father spent 20 years fighting these people from the shadows. Maybe it's time someone fought them in the light." Morrison looked at her with something that might have been respect. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we stop running," Sarah said, thinking of the wall of names in the tunnel below, of the mother who'd been driven away to protect her, of the father who'd spent his life fighting battles he couldn't win because he fought them alone. "My father gave me access to 20 years of evidence about corruption and conspiracy at the highest levels of government. Maybe it's time that evidence saw the light of day." The sound of helicopters reached them from the distance, multiple aircraft approaching from different directions. Some of them might be federal backup, others might belong to the people hunting them. But either way, Sarah Martinez was done hiding from a legacy she'd never asked for but was clearly destined to inherit. She was Miguel Martinez's daughter, raised by a man who taught her that some fights were worth having even when you couldn't win them. And now, standing in a Tennessee woods with evidence that could topple governments and expose decades of corruption, Sarah was ready to finish the fight her father had started. The helicopters were getting closer, and Morrison was checking his weapon one more time. But Sarah was thinking about names carved in stone, about mothers driven away by necessity, about fathers who sacrificed everything for causes larger than themselves. She was thinking about what it meant to be the daughter of a man who'd spent his life protecting people who would never know his name, and what it might mean to finally give that life and that sacrifice the recognition it deserved. The helicopters circled overhead like mechanical vultures, their rotor wash bending the trees and filling the air with dust and debris. Sarah counted at least 4 aircraft, 2 black helicopters that screamed government operation, and 2 others in civilian colors that could have belonged to anyone with enough money to field private military contractors.
The sound was deafening, a mechanical thunderstorm that made conversation impossible and turned the peaceful Tennessee woods into a war zone. Morrison grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward a cluster of large oak trees that might provide some cover from aerial observation. His radio was crackling with chatter, multiple voices overlapping in the kind of coordinated chaos that suggested a major operation unfolding in real time. "Control, this is Alpha Team Leader," Morrison shouted into his radio, trying to be heard over the helicopter noise. "I have the asset in custody and am requesting immediate extraction, multiple hostile aircraft in the area." The response was garbled with static and rotor noise, but Sarah caught enough words to understand that Morrison's backup was still 10 minutes away. 10 minutes that might as well have been 10 hours, given the resources arrayed against them. One of the black helicopters was descending toward a clearing about 200 yards away, moving with the confidence of a military operation that had overwhelming superiority. Sarah could see figures in tactical gear rappelling from the aircraft before it even touched down, spreading out in a search pattern that would inevitably lead them to the storm drain exit. "We need to move," Morrison said, but Sarah was already moving, not away from the approaching forces, but toward them. "Sarah!" Morrison called, but she was running now, crashing through the underbrush with the determination of someone who had finally understood what needed to be done. She burst into the clearing just as the first helicopter's engines were winding down, her hands raised, but her voice carrying clearly across the sudden relative quiet. "My name is Sarah Martinez. I'm Miguel Martinez's daughter, and I have something you want." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Red laser dots appeared on her chest as a dozen weapons trained on her position. Voices shouted commands in multiple languages, and Sarah realized that the people hunting her weren't all from the same organization. This was a convergence of interests, multiple players who had been drawn together by the promise of accessing her father's intelligence network. But it was the man who stepped forward from behind the helicopter that made Sarah's blood run cold. Tall, silver-haired, wearing a $1,000 suit that looked ridiculous in the middle of a Tennessee forest, he moved with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room. "Miss Martinez," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite the distance between them. "I'm Deputy Director Harrison Walsh, Central Intelligence Agency. I've been looking forward to meeting Miguel Martinez's daughter." Sarah had never heard the name before, but something about the way he said it, the familiarity, the hint of old grievances, told her that this man had known her father well. And from the way Morrison stiffened beside her, she gathered that Walsh's presence here was not good news for anyone who valued due process or constitutional protections. "Deputy Director," Morrison said carefully, "this is an FBI operation. Miss Martinez is under federal protection." Walsh's smile was cold and precise. "Agent Morrison, I'm afraid your jurisdiction ends where national security begins. Miss Martinez and her father's files are now a matter of vital interest to the intelligence community." Sarah stepped forward, ignoring the laser sights that tracked her movement. "You knew my father," she said. It wasn't a question. "I recruited your father 22 years ago when he was just another disabled veteran struggling to find purpose after his military service ended. I gave him that purpose. I gave him the chance to serve his country in ways that mattered more than anything he'd done in uniform." The admission hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her father hadn't just stumbled into intelligence work. He'd been actively recruited, targeted, brought into a world that would ultimately consume everything he cared about. "You destroyed his life," Sarah said, anger giving her voice strength. "You destroyed my family." "I gave your father the opportunity to make a difference. The choices he made, the sacrifices he decided were necessary, those were his decisions. But now those decisions have consequences that extend far beyond your family's personal tragedy." One of the civilian helicopters was landing now, disgorging men who definitely weren't American government personnel. Sarah caught glimpses of foreign uniforms, equipment with Cyrillic markings, weapons that looked like they belonged in Eastern European conflicts rather than Tennessee forests. "Friends of yours?" asked Walsh, his hand hovering near his weapon despite being outnumbered 20-1. "Business associates," Walsh replied smoothly. "Your father's work touched many international interests, Miss Martinez. Some of those interests are eager to ensure that certain information remains confidential." I understood. This wasn't just about her father's intelligence files or evidence of corruption. This was about the international networks he'd infiltrated, the foreign assets he'd run, the operational details that could compromise ongoing intelligence operations across multiple countries. Her father's death had created an intelligence vacuum that multiple nations were scrambling to fill. "The files are encrypted. Even if you kill me, even if you tear apart everything my father built, you won't be able to access them without the proper codes."
Walsh's expression didn't change, but Sarah saw something shift in his eyes. "Miss Martinez, you've already accessed the files. Our technical teams have been monitoring your activities since you entered the bunker. We know you have the access codes, and we know you've seen the contents of your father's archives." Of course they'd been watching. The mysterious attackers at the barn, the quick response to their escape through the tunnel, the coordinated arrival of multiple aircraft, this had been planned, orchestrated, managed from the beginning. She and Morrison had never been escaping. They'd been herded, driven toward this confrontation like sheep toward a slaughter. "What do you want?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "I want you to transfer your father's files to our secure servers. All of them. The operational records, the financial documents, the evidence of corruption, everything. In exchange, you'll be relocated with a new identity, a comfortable life, somewhere far from here, and the satisfaction of knowing that your father's work will continue to protect American interests. And if I refuse?" Walsh gestured toward the foreign operatives who were setting up some kind of communications equipment near their helicopter. "Then I turn you over to people who have much less pleasant methods of extracting information. Your father made enemies in places where human rights are considered a Western luxury, Miss Martinez. Some of those enemies are here today, and they've been very patient." Sarah looked around the clearing, taking in the tactical positions, the weapons, the careful spacing that suggested this was a carefully planned operation with multiple contingencies. Morrison was outgunned and outnumbered, but she could see him calculating angles, looking for opportunities, preparing to make whatever sacrifice might be necessary to protect her. But Sarah was thinking about something else, about the wall of names in her father's tunnel, about the costs of fighting battles in shadows and silence. Her father had spent 20 years trying to protect his country while protecting his family, and in the end, he'd failed at both. The corruption he'd discovered was still there, still bleeding money from programs meant to save lives. The networks he'd infiltrated were still operating, still profiting from misery and death. "There's another option," Sarah said, pulling out her phone. "One you haven't considered." Walsh's expression sharpened. "Miss Martinez, I strongly advise you not to do anything precipitous. The situation here is delicate, and there are many ways it could go badly for everyone involved." But Sarah was already scrolling through her contacts, looking for a number she'd memorized years ago, but never thought she'd need. The direct line to the newsroom at CNN, where a former nursing school classmate worked as a producer. Someone who would recognize Sarah's voice, who would listen when she said she had a story that needed to be told immediately. Sarah Martinez, I haven't heard from you since graduation. What's wrong? You sound—" "Jess," Sarah interrupted, "I'm about to send you the biggest story of your career.
20 years of evidence about government corruption, international conspiracy, and intelligence operations that have been stealing billions of dollars meant to protect American lives. Can you get it on the air immediately? The silence on the other end of the line lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then, "Sarah, where are you? Are you safe? This sounds—" "I'm not safe," Sarah said, looking directly at Walsh as she spoke. "I'm surrounded by people who want to bury this story along with me, but I'm about to upload everything to a secure server that will automatically release the files if I don't check in every 12 hours. The story goes public either way. The only question is whether I live to see it happen."
Walsh was speaking rapidly into his own radio, and Sarah could see the tactical team's repositioning. But she was already executing the upload protocol her father had built into his files, transferring decades of evidence to multiple servers, news organizations, and government watchdog groups simultaneously. 20 years of evidence, she continued, speaking loud enough for everyone in the clearing to hear. Bank records showing billions of dollars diverted from anti-terrorism programs to private accounts, lists of politicians who took bribes to approve weapons contracts, operational details of torture programs that violated international law, photos and videos of atrocities committed by American personnel and their allies. The upload progress bar on her phone showed 60% complete. Sarah kept talking, knowing that every second she bought was another gigabyte of evidence making its way to people who would ensure it saw daylight. My father discovered that the war on terror had become a business opportunity for people who saw dead soldiers and dead civilians as acceptable costs for higher profits, she said. He tried to stop it through official channels and learned that the corruption went all the way to the top. So he went rogue, spent 20 years gathering evidence, building a case that could expose the entire network. 80% complete. Walsh was screaming into his radio now, demanding that technical teams find a way to stop the upload. But Sarah had learned her father's lessons well. The systems he'd built were designed to resist exactly this kind of interference. "Deputy Director Walsh," Sarah called out, "you recruited my father because you thought he'd be a useful tool, someone desperate enough and damaged enough to do the dirty work without asking questions. But you underestimated him. He never stopped asking questions, and he never stopped looking for answers." 90% complete. The foreign operatives were packing up their equipment, preparing to leave now that the situation had spiraled beyond their ability to control. Whatever they'd hoped to accomplish here, it was no longer possible once the files became public. "And you definitely underestimated his daughter," Sarah concluded as the progress bar hit 100%. "Upload complete, Jess. The story is yours. Make sure it gets told." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of helicopters starting their engines. The foreign teams were already boarding their aircraft, recognizing that their window of opportunity had closed. Walsh looked like a man who had just watched his career implode in real time. "Miss Martinez," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage, "you have no idea what you've just done. The damage to national security, the operations that will be compromised, the lives that will be lost." "The lives that will be saved," Sarah corrected. "The money that will go to programs that actually protect people instead of enriching politicians. The soldiers who won't die because someone wanted to test a weapon system that didn't work. The civilians who won't be tortured because it's profitable for contractors who bill by the hour." Morrison stepped up beside her, his weapon finally drawn and trained on Walsh. "Deputy Director Walsh, I think your business here is concluded. Miss Martinez is still under FBI protection, and I suggest you and your friends clear the area before my backup arrives." Walsh looked around the clearing, taking in the departing helicopters, the tactical teams that were standing down now that their primary objective had become impossible. "This isn't over," he said finally. "You think exposing these operations will make the world safer? You've just guaranteed that the next generation of threats will be harder to detect, harder to stop. Your father understood the necessity of working in the shadows. Apparently his daughter prefers to stumble around in the light." "My father worked in the shadows because he thought it was the only way to protect the people he loved. But shadows are where corruption grows, where accountability dies, where good people convince themselves that terrible things are necessary. Maybe it's time for a little sunlight.
As Walsh and his remaining personnel departed, Sarah found herself alone in the clearing with Morrison and the approaching sound of actual FBI backup. The immediate crisis was over, but she knew the larger battle was just beginning. The files she'd released would trigger investigations, congressional hearings, international incidents. People would lose their jobs, face criminal charges, spend years in courtrooms defending actions they'd thought were safely buried in classified archives. "You realize," Morrison said, "that you're going to be the most protected witness in federal custody for the foreseeable future. There are going to be a lot of very powerful people who want you dead." "Let them come," Sarah said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. "My father spent 20 years protecting me by keeping me ignorant. I'm done being ignorant and I'm done being protected. If there are people who profit from corruption and conspiracy, who see human lives as acceptable costs for their business plans, then maybe they should be afraid for a change." The FBI helicopters were landing now, disgorging teams of agents who moved with the organized efficiency of people responding to a major incident. Sarah would spend the next several hours in debriefings, explaining how she'd accessed her father's files, what she'd found there, why she'd chosen to make them public. She'd become the center of a media storm that would make her one of the most famous whistleblowers in American history. But standing in that Tennessee clearing, watching the last of Walsh's helicopters disappear over the horizon, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since her father's death: peace. She'd inherited more than just a barn and some mysterious equipment. She'd inherited a mission, a purpose, a reason to honor her father's sacrifice by finishing what he'd started. Miguel Martinez had spent his life fighting in shadows to protect the people he loved. His daughter would fight in the light to protect everyone else. It seemed like a fitting legacy for a man who'd given everything for causes larger than himself. The story was just beginning, but for the first time since finding that letter from the lawyer, Sarah felt ready for whatever came next. 6 months later, Sarah faced the cameras in the packed congressional hearing room. Senator Thompson leaned into her microphone. "Miss Martinez, can you explain how your father uncovered corruption that escaped our oversight mechanisms?" Sarah adjusted the thick folder before her. "Senator, my father wasn't escaping oversight. He was excluded from it. When investigators benefit from the crimes they're supposed to prevent, oversight becomes cover-up. Camera crews from every major news network lined the walls, their lenses trained on the woman who had become the most famous whistleblower since Daniel Ellsberg released the Pentagon Papers." Sarah pulled out a chart. "This shows $14 billion diverted from anti-terrorism programs." She pointed to the connections. "Senator Mitchell, your name appears 17 times, connected to your brother-in-law's defense contracts. Care to explain $2.3 million in payments for approving defective equipment that killed soldiers?" Mitchell's face went pale. Those documents, I haven't had a chance to review." "The documents are authentic, Senator." She stood and approached the easel that had been set up for visual aids, her movement tracked by dozens of cameras. "This chart shows the flow of money from legitimate defense contracts to shell companies controlled by politicians and bureaucrats. My father spent years documenting these transfers, photographing meetings, recording conversations. He built an intelligence network of his own, staffed by people who were as disgusted by the corruption as he was." Senator James Mitchell, ranking minority member, leaned forward with the aggressive posture of someone trying to score political points. "Ms. Martinez, your father's activities as you've described them sound like they violated numerous federal laws. Are you asking this committee to believe that criminal activity is justified when it's done in service of exposing other criminal activity?" Sarah met his gaze directly. "Senator Mitchell, I noticed that your name appears in 17 of my father's financial documents connected to defense contracts awarded to companies owned by your brother-in-law. Perhaps you'd like to explain those connections before questioning my father's methods." The gallery erupted in gasps and excited whispers. Senator Mitchell's face went pale, then red, then pale again. Those documents are... I haven't had a chance to review." "The documents are authentic, Senator," Sarah continued calmly. "They show payments totaling $2.3 million made to accounts under your control in exchange for your support of weapons systems that testing showed were defective. Soldiers died using equipment you helped approve, knowing it didn't work because someone paid you to ignore the test results." Senator Thompson gavelled for order as the gallery noise grew louder. "The chair will remind both the witness and committee members that these proceedings are being broadcast live, and all statements should be made with appropriate consideration for their public impact." Sarah returned to her seat, her point made. Over the past 6 months, she'd learned to use publicity as a weapon, to leverage the media attention that had made her famous into protection for herself and accountability for others. The people who'd wanted to silence her now had to consider that any harm that came to her would only generate more attention for the evidence she'd revealed. "Ms. Martinez," Senator Thompson continued, "you've testified that your father left you more than just intelligence files. Can you describe the other resources he provided?" Sarah nodded and pulled out a photograph that had been taken in the barn just days after the confrontation in the forest. "My father left me a network, Senator. Dozens of assets in government, military, and intelligence positions who shared his commitment to exposing corruption. People who had been feeding him information for years, who continued their work even after his death." The photograph showed Agent Morrison standing beside a German shepherd that looked exactly like the kind of dog her father had described in his final days. "This is Koenig, my father's most important asset, a trained intelligence dog who was conditioned to locate hidden electronic devices, encrypted storage media, and concealed documents. Koenig had been living in the barn, waiting for me to find him, protecting my father's backup files." Senator Thompson's eyebrows rose. "A dog? Your father used a dog for intelligence operations?" "Koenig is trained to detect the electromagnetic signatures of specific types of storage devices. Over the past 6 months, he's helped law enforcement agencies locate hidden evidence in 17 different locations across 12 states. My father trained him to respond to specific commands that would lead investigators to documents that corroborate everything I've testified about today." The dog in question was currently living with Sarah in a secure federal facility, part of her witness protection arrangements. But Koenig wasn't just a pet. He was a working partner, still helping to uncover the full scope of the conspiracy her father had spent his life documenting. "The evidence your father gathered," Senator Thompson said, "has already led to the arrest and indictment of 43 individuals, including 2 sitting members of Congress, 1 federal judge, and multiple high-ranking military officers. CIA Deputy Director Walsh has resigned and is facing federal charges. International arrest warrants have been issued for foreign nationals connected to the conspiracy. From your perspective, has justice been served?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Senator, my father died believing he'd failed. He'd spent 20 years fighting corruption and conspiracy, and from his perspective, nothing had changed. The same people were in power, the same money was being stolen, the same soldiers and civilians were dying for someone else's profit. He died thinking his sacrifice had been meaningless." She paused, looking out at the gallery filled with journalists, federal investigators, family members of victims, and ordinary citizens who had driven hours to witness this moment of accountability. But I think my father was wrong about failure. Every document he preserved, every photograph he took, every conversation he recorded, it all mattered. Not because it immediately stopped the corruption, but because it created the possibility of stopping it. Sometimes the most important victories are the ones that make future victories possible. 3 hours later, as Sarah gathered her papers, a woman approached, professionally dressed, weary but determined. "Miss Martinez, I'm Elena Santos. I was married to Miguel Martinez from 1995 to 2010. Sarah's heart stopped. Her mother. After 16 years of absence, her mother was standing in a congressional hearing room, looking older and more tired than Sarah remembered, but unmistakably the woman who'd raised her for the first 12 years of her life. "Mom," Sarah whispered, and suddenly the formal hearing room dissolved into irrelevance. She was 12 years old again, standing in their kitchen watching her mother pack suitcases, while her father sat at the table with his head in his hands, none of them understanding that this moment of family dissolution was actually an act of love. "I've been watching your testimony. Your father would be so proud," Elena said, her voice thick with emotion. "You left us," Sarah said, and despite everything she'd learned, despite all the revelations about her father's work and the reasons behind her family's destruction, the accusation still carried the pain of a child who'd never understood why her mother had abandoned her.
"I left because your father made me leave," Elena replied gently. "Because he showed me evidence that people were willing to kill families to get to him. Because he convinced me that the only way to protect you was to make it appear that we were no longer important to him." Sarah felt tears she'd been holding back for months finally overflow. "The wall in the tunnel? Your name was carved there, with all the other costs of his work." Elena nodded. "He showed me that wall before I left. He said it was important that I understand I wasn't just losing a husband, I was becoming part of his mission. That keeping you safe was the most important intelligence operation he'd ever run." They stood in the empty hearing room, mother and daughter reunited by the very revelations that had initially seemed to destroy everything Sarah thought she knew about her family. Around them, journalists and investigators continued their work, turning testimony into news stories and indictments, transforming one woman's personal tragedy into a national reckoning with corruption and conspiracy. "What happens now?" Elena asked. Sarah looked around the hearing room, thinking about the months of testimony and investigation still to come, the trials that would determine whether the people responsible for decades of corruption would face consequences for their actions. She thought about Koenig waiting in their secure apartment, ready to help investigators find more hidden evidence. She thought about her father's network of assets, still active, still gathering information about threats to American interests. "We finish what he started," Sarah said. "We make sure the story gets told completely, that everyone responsible faces consequences, that the systems get changed so this can't happen again." Elena smiled, and for the first time in 16 years, Sarah saw something in her mother's face that reminded her of the woman who'd sung her to sleep and helped her with homework and made her feel safe in a world that had always been more dangerous than either of them knew. "Miguel always said you were stronger than either of us," Elena said. "I think he was right." As they walked out of the Capitol building together, Sarah realized that her father's greatest legacy wasn't the intelligence he'd gathered or the corruption he'd exposed. It was the family he'd protected, even when that protection required him to sacrifice his own happiness. He'd spent 20 years fighting in the shadows to keep the people he loved safe.
Now his daughter would spend however long it took fighting in the light to keep everyone else safe too. The story that had begun with a mysterious barn and an unexpected inheritance had become something much larger, a reckoning with power and accountability, a test of whether institutions designed to protect democracy could survive the revelation of their own corruption. But for Sarah Martinez, walking down the Capitol steps with the mother she'd thought she'd lost forever, it was simpler than that. It was the completion of a promise made by a dying father to a daughter he'd never stopped protecting, even when she didn't know she needed protection. It was proof that some legacies are worth inheriting, no matter how much they cost. Thanks for staying with Sarah through this incredible journey, from nurse to whistleblower to intelligence operative. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, please like this video, share it with friends who love conspiracy thrillers, and subscribe for more stories that reveal the secrets hidden in ordinary lives. What inheritance would change your life forever? Let me know in the comments below.
2 years after inheriting her father's secret intelligence files, Sarah Martinez has transformed from a hospital nurse into the director of the Government Accountability Institute, a powerful organization dedicated to exposing government corruption. Operating from a bulletproof office in Washington, D.C., she works alongside Koenig, her father's retired German shepherd, who continues to assist in investigations despite his advanced age. Sarah faces a major setback when the Justice Department backs down from prosecuting Meridian Defense, a corrupt defense contractor that sold defective body armor to the military, resulting in 17 soldier deaths. Senator Patricia Hawkins, who received substantial campaign contributions from Meridian, claims national security concerns require plea deals rather than public trials. Sarah recognizes this as transparent corruption. Hawkins and her husband's consulting firm received nearly $3 million from Meridian-related companies. Refusing to accept this injustice, Sarah calls a press conference where she reveals her father's detailed investigation into Meridian Defense. She presents damning evidence, internal communications showing the company knew their armor failed against standard bullets, Pentagon officials blocking independent testing in exchange for consulting contracts, and Senator Hawkins increasing Meridian's defense contracts by 340% despite knowing about the armor failures. Sarah's masterstroke comes when she announces the complete public release of all Meridian defense files, every document, photograph, and recorded conversation her father had gathered over 5 years. This transparency strategy proves devastatingly effective, generating massive public outrage and forcing accountability despite government resistance. The success of Sarah's anti-corruption campaign triggers a violent response. At 2:17 a.m., she receives an emergency call informing her that Judge Patricia Williams, who was scheduled to preside over the Meridian defense trials, has been the target of an assassination attempt by 3 professional gunmen. Williams' reputation for refusing plea deals in corruption cases made her a threat to the criminal networks Sarah has been exposing. The attack's sophistication suggests serious financial backing, the kind of resources that come from defense contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. If Williams dies or becomes incapacitated, the case would be reassigned to Judge Robert Manning, a former defense contractor attorney known for ruling in favor of government secrecy and corporate privilege. Sarah receives a mysterious encrypted message from someone claiming to be a friend, leading to a meeting at coordinates in rural Virginia. There, she encounters Colonel Robert Hayes, a key figure from her father's files who reveals the true scope of her inheritance. Her father hadn't just gathered intelligence on corruption, he had built a parallel intelligence network of 47 operatives from CIA, NSA, military intelligence, and FBI backgrounds. These were professionals who had discovered their own agencies were protecting the criminals they were supposed to investigate. The barn where Sarah's journey began was merely one node in a sophisticated network spanning the entire country. Hayes reveals that the assassination attempt on Judge Williams was part of a coordinated campaign by a group calling themselves the Meridian Group,
a consortium of current and former government officials involved in arms dealing, human trafficking, and drug smuggling across 5 continents. They've identified credible threats against 12 federal judges, 4 congressional investigators, and 3 journalists covering corruption cases. Hayes offers Sarah control of her father's shadow network, explaining that her father had always intended for someone outside the intelligence community to lead it, someone who couldn't be compromised by institutional loyalties or career ambitions. This would mean moving beyond legal and media pressure to engage in active intelligence gathering, financial warfare against criminal enterprises, and direct action against threats the legal system cannot address. Sarah realizes that accepting this role would make her a criminal in the eyes of the legal system she's been trying to reform. However, she understands that traditional law enforcement is helpless against corruption extending into the highest levels of government, where criminals own enough judges, prosecutors, and investigators to ensure evidence disappears and witnesses die. Sarah accepts leadership of the network and launches the first coordinated operation, simultaneous raids on financial institutions in 7 countries, targeting the Meridian Group's criminal profits. The criminal network's predictable violent response, an attack on Sarah's apartment building, fails because she had anticipated it and relocated to secure facilities. The network's counterattack proves devastatingly effective. The gunmen find themselves arrested by FBI teams with detailed intelligence about their identities and escape routes. Officials who ordered attacks discover their communications intercepted and recorded, providing evidence of conspiracy to commit murder. Within a week, the seemingly untouchable corruption network collapses under combined financial pressure, criminal prosecution, and public exposure.
Senator Hawkins resigns, citing health concerns. Judge Manning recuses himself from corruption cases after evidence surfaces of his financial conflicts, and the Meridian defense trials proceed under Judge Williams, resulting in convictions with sentences reflecting the true scope of the crimes against American service members. The most meaningful victory for Sarah comes 6 months later, in a letter from the family of a soldier killed wearing defective armor. They inform her that her father's name has been added to a memorial wall, honoring those who died fighting for American values, acknowledging that Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez didn't die in combat, but gave his life fighting enemies of the country. Sarah reflects on her transformation from a grieving daughter who discovered her father's secret world through a mysterious letter to the leader of a shadow intelligence network. Her father had spent 20 years fighting corruption from the shadows, believing exposure was impossible and justice unattainable. Sarah proved him wrong by bringing accountability to people who thought themselves above the law. The Government Accountability Institute continues exposing corruption through legal channels and media pressure. But Sarah's real power comes from her father's network, 47 operatives who understand that sometimes the most patriotic action is working outside the system to save the system from itself. Sarah's inheritance encompassed more than files, evidence, and secret facilities. Her father left her a mission, a purpose, and the necessary tools to complete his work. Miguel Martinez died believing he had failed to protect his country from internal corruption. But his daughter proved that the most important battles are often won not by those who start them, but by those with the courage to finish them. The story that began with a mysterious letter and a barn full of secrets evolved into something larger, a transformation of American intelligence and law enforcement, creating accountability where institutional corruption had seemed insurmountable. For Sarah, it remained fundamentally simple, a daughter keeping a promise to a father who gave everything to protect the people he loved. The inheritance proved worth accepting, regardless of its personal costs, and the vital work of protecting democracy from internal threats continues.